Hello, everyone, and thank you for the warm welcome. I'd like to thank the Department of Education of Puerto Rico for sponsoring this, and Jose Enrique Fernandez, whose Kinesis Foundation is very involved in putting this all together, and all of his staff. So, off we go. I don't have to tell you that the cost of college, the rising cost of college, is a big issue for America, for the United States, and for people here in Puerto Rico. You see it in the media all the time. Every year around this, in a couple of months, the College Board will issue a news release indicating how much college costs have gone up from last year to the current year that we'll be in. That'll come out at the end of October or so. Typically in the article, there's always a reference to the highest priced private school in the country. And unfortunately, a lot of people who read this information will assume that college costs as much as this highest priced college. And it's very discouraging, it's very confusing. Also on the topic of student loans, you see a lot of information in the newspaper lately about the high level of debt that the rising college costs is forcing students to take. Unfortunately, the articles that are written typically will highlight some very sad, legitimate stories of former students who now have an excessive amount of debt, and they're struggling. They're struggling, they can't get married, they can't buy a house, they can't start a family. These are very sad stories, but they are not representative of what the typical borrower is facing. However, they do sell newspapers, they do attract attention, and I think when you're in school and you're studying journalism, there must be a course in the very beginning that says, don't write about safe plane landings. They won't attract attention. You want to write about train wrecks. So the story of a poor person who borrowed too much money, who can't afford to make payments, is not at all representative, but it does sell newspapers. However, the rising cost of college is a very legitimate concern. It's taking up a greater percentage of a family's income than ever before. There are increasing levels of debt. There's no question about that. It's a major issue for public policy makers, both at the federal and state level. It's an institutional challenge. We're trying to continue to provide a quality education. It does cost money. It's a legitimate concern for parents and students. And of course, the media finds it a very attractive topic also. So the federal government especially is doing all kinds of things lately to try to reduce the rate of increase in college costs. And they're taking a number of steps. And if you listen to President Obama's remarks this past week in Pennsylvania and Ohio, he made 4 or 5 different stops. The big issue is rising college costs. So he and his administration, more than ever, is pushing for better understanding by families of what college costs really mean. 20 years ago, no, 1965, longer than that, when the Higher Education Act was passed by President Johnson, it focused on providing access and opportunity. Access was the big word, and it was the primary word for several decades. About 20 years ago, rising college costs, or affordability, became the prominent issue. Today, the prominent issue is accountability. So access, affordability, accountability, outcomes, measures of performance. There's the focus right now. And you see it in different ways. You can see regulations that are pushing for transparency on costs and net costs. We'll explain that in a minute. There's a new tool called the net price calculator. There's a push for schools to publish their indicators of performance. We'll talk about those. There's a push for more transparency. There's going to be something called the list of shame that's going to indicate the schools, the top 10 schools who had the largest increase in their costs. That will be embarrassing for those institutions. And there's also a push that at the end of the process, can your graduates actually get jobs? Outcomes, accountability. Why do college costs continue to rise at the rate they do? There's been a lot of studies. Congress put a commission together in the late 90s to investigate, and they identified a number of what they call cost drivers. And these are the things they identified. Number one, it's a very people-heavy industry. There's a lot of faculty and staff. Compensation includes the cost of health care, the benefits, which of course are rising greater than the rate of inflation. That's a big cost driver. But also, the need to maintain your facilities. You want to defer fixing the roof, and then 10 years later it falls in and costs you a lot more money, or do you want to do preventive maintenance? Utilities, including fuel, usually are higher than inflation. Technology is continually changing. You have to keep up. If you don't keep up, you're not going to be able to do what you're supposed to do, and you can't be competitive with other institutions. So there's pressure to keep fixing technology and improving it. And it was supposed to reduce the number of people that were going to be involved, the greater use of technology. There are more people working to support technology now by the hundreds on a lot of campuses than ever before. The cost of regulations, government regulations. The last time the Higher Education Act was amended, about 4 years ago, there were 150 new regulations added. Also, schools want to compete with one another. So you're trying to recruit a student, your competitor up the road is trying to recruit the same student. You have to do some special things. That costs money. Also, we call this maybe keeping up with the Joneses. That's an American expression, keeping up with the Joneses. If the school up the street that you compete with just added a climbing wall or a second swimming pool, you feel the pressure to do the same thing to help recruit students. Keeping up with the Joneses is a cost driver. Financial aid is a cost driver. Well, how does that become a cost driver? It's a major cost driver. If a student receives a scholarship for $5,000, that student and family doesn't have to pay the institution $5,000. The bill is reduced by $5,000. Does the institution still receive revenue of $5,000? It does if there's a benefactor behind the $5,000 scholarship, or there's an endowment that's generating $5,000 of income to pay for the scholarship. The vast majority of scholarships are unfunded. That means there's no money to come in to pay for the $5,000 scholarship. What the institution is doing is reducing the bill behind the scenes. There's no revenue of $5,000. It's okay for the family, they don't have to pay $5,000, but the school is out $5,000 of revenue. That becomes an expense. The expense has to be offset by revenue. The revenue primarily is tuition. Scholarship spending has skyrocketed. In addition to students needing more help, as a reason why additional scholarships are being spent, there's also what I would call merit wars, merit scholarship wars. You keep upping the ante, adding additional scholarship to keep up and be competitive. It's very, very expensive, and it's a cost driver. Finally, if you work in the public sector, which all of you do, you know that the state legislatures who support public education from kindergarten all the way through college, the state legislatures are reducing their commitments to funding. Not all states, but a vast majority are doing that. So if you have less revenue coming in to operate your budget as an institution, either you reduce what you did this year when you come to next year, or you have to find other revenue to make up for the lost subsidy coming from the state. A lot of schools raise tuition to offset the loss of public support. This clearly hits the public sector more than any other sector. 80% of the students in the country attend public institutions. So this is a major cost driver for them. So let's talk about the different terms. This is a part of the confusion that's out there. The cost of college, the cost to educate, is one concept. What does it cost to educate a person at a particular school? No one pays the full cost. No student is paying the full cost of instruction. There is usually subsidies coming from a school's endowment, coming from the state legislature, coming from benefactors. No one is paying the full cost. Okay? Sticker price is yet another term. The sticker price is when you go to the website or open the catalog, it says, here's the price for tuition, fees, room, and board. That's the sticker price. The net price is what you have to pay after scholarships and grants. So here's the bill, tuition, fees, room, and board. Subtract the amount of scholarships and grants. That is your cost, or what we call net cost. Finally, the cost of attendance is yet another term. The cost of attendance is what's it going to cost me to send my kid to a particular school. Tuition, fees, room and board, yes. But all students have additional expenses for books and supplies, for transportation, a couple of times at least back and forth to home a year, and personal expenses, haircuts, laundry, clothing, social expenses. Those indirect expenses could be anywhere from $1,000 to $3,000, depending on a lot of moving factors. But you can't ignore those. Those are expenses you have to prepare for. Indirect expenses. So the cost of attendance is direct expenses, the bill, plus indirect expenses. There's a growing knowledge in America, and here in Puerto Rico, that higher education is absolutely essential. Some kind of post-secondary training is critical, typically, for success. The global society, and how if we want to be competitive in the global society, we're going to need to have a better educated workforce. But when you try to control costs and preserve quality, there's tension. To increase and enhance quality costs money, usually. So there are suggestions that institutions of higher education need to be more efficient. Maybe instead of 4 years, for example, for a bachelor's degree, it can be done in 3 years. There is a new term out there these days called MOOCs, M-O-O-C, Massive Open Online Course. Some pretty prestigious institutions, Stanford, are beginning to offer courses that anybody can look on the web and take. Will this be the future of higher education? It's a question. If you're only online, are you still having the same experience as a face-to-face? It's a big question. Some are suggesting that we eliminate some of the amenities and services. So do you really need to have a second swimming pool? Do you need to offer all these special services that you provide for students and families? Do you need to have a football team? These are questions that are being asked. Maybe we can make larger classes. Instead of 50 students in the classroom, maybe we can have 500. That would be more efficient. Maybe we need to hire more adjunct professors. An adjunct professor, by definition, is not a full-time employee. He or she is a part-time employee. There are no benefits to adjunct professors. There's no tenure for adjunct professors. Typically, an adjunct professor is doing something else full-time and can't stay in his office or her office to see students sometimes. Finally, maybe we could reduce requirements. Instead of 120 credits for a degree, maybe we only need 100. These are suggestions that are being made. This is a rather busy chart, but it shows over a 20-year period from 82, 83 to the last year, what's happened to college costs? Just tuition and fees, not room and board. This line here is what's happened in the four-year public sector. It's increased 357% over 20 years. This also is a very busy chart. It's published by the College Board every year. The new one will come out in a couple of months. But you can see four categories of schools. Two-year publics, four-year publics, four-year publics if you're coming from out of state, and finally the private four-year sector. The blues, the dark blues, are the tuition and fees. The next color, the orange I guess, is room and board. And then these other expenses afterwards, personal, books, transportation. At the end of each, you see the total cost of attendance. Okay? So here's some facts. The net price, again, is what you pay as a family after you've reduced your bill by scholarships and grants, and you might even include tax credits that are available from the federal government. Two-thirds, it's actually, this data is almost a year old. It's over 70% of students in college receive student aid. These costs were on the chart before, but you can see the cost of tuition and fees the year that just ended for four-year public, out-of-state four-year public, two-year private, two-year public, and four-year private. Those are the average costs for each of those sectors just for tuition and fees. Last year, $185 billion was awarded to undergraduate students. $97 billion of that was in the form of grants. The rest was loans and work and tax credits from the federal government. 30% of this is an amazing statistic. Talk about the cost. 30% of first-year students do not return for the second year. Huge cost. Listen, look at this one. 40% of the students who start in four-year schools, less than 40% will have a bachelor's degree in 4 years. Less than 40% of the students who are starting in four-year schools will finish on time. If you give them 6 years, the statistic is 60%. So all the other students don't finish within 6 years, may never finish. That doesn't mean they're not paying expenses, that they're not borrowing money, of course. So, what can you, as guidance counselors, secondary school officials, do to help your students and families understand how to pick a college that is a financially responsible decision? What are the indicators of success, of performance at the institution? What kinds of questions should you be asking? Should they be asking? Here's what you can suggest. What are the admissions and financial aid policies of the school? In their admissions process, are they need blind? Which means, do you look at a student's and family ability to pay as part of the admissions decision? Some schools do. Some publish that they do, some don't publish it. It's not a very positive policy. But what are the admissions policies of the school? Then what are the financial aid policies? If you admit a student who needs help, do you help the student? How do you help the student? Those are public policies that you should have access to, that you can help provide realistic guidance to students and families. Again, here's the big question. You ask the admissions counselor, and the counselor should know this information. What percentage of your students come back after the first year? What is your graduation rate? What is your on-time graduation rate? What is the ability of your graduates to be placed in full-time employment within a year of graduation? What is the acceptance rate of your graduates into professional school and graduate school? What is the satisfaction level of your alumni? Did they have a good experience? What is the amount of debt that your graduating student is going to be facing? What is the default rate at your institution for students who borrowed? That's an indicator. Some students didn't, the likelihood of defaulting is skyrocketing for students who did not receive their final degree. If you didn't finish your education, your chances for default are much, much greater. Maybe you didn't have a good experience and you're not going to pay as a result. You're not going to pay the government because you didn't have a good experience at the school. Maybe you can't get a job. There are a lot of reasons that contribute to the default rate, including the economy. We all have that challenge right now. But that could be an indicator of performance, default rate. What are these salaries 10 years out after graduation? And what's the student-faculty ratio? All of these would be indicators of the institution's performance. What happens if you don't finish in 4 years? 8 semesters. Well, you have to go a 9th or 10th or 11th or 12th or even more. So what happens then? Somebody's got to pay the bill for the extra time. You're going to take out additional debt as a student and or a parent. If you're in a public school where 80% of the students attend, the subsidies from the state continue. Huge. Lost opportunity costs. That's what the economists refer to people who can't do what they should be doing. In other words, if you're still in school for a 5th or 6th year, rather than being out in the workforce, you're losing money that you could have made. That's the economists call the cost of lost opportunity. That's a lot. Finally, there's the cost of a student who can't go because there's no room there, because you're still there doing 9, 10, 11 semesters. Why do some students take more time? Well, there's some things we can't avoid. People get sick. There are health issues. There are financial disasters that occur in families. There's death. Things like that are going to be very difficult to try to control. But when you start as a freshman, you have to take 1, 2, or 3 remedial courses: reading, writing, math. Those courses, because they're remedial, don't carry college credit. You have to pay for them, but they don't. So that means you got to add time in to the other end of your program. That's one big reason why students need more than 4 years. In some institutions, there's inadequate counseling. A student is about to drop a course. What are the consequences of that? Is anybody advising that student? What's going to happen? Maybe you can't get into a course because it's all filled up. Well, whose fault's that? Certainly not the students. Some, if you can believe it, have what I call a laissez-faire attitude. This is the best time of your life. Enjoy. Fish around. Experiment with this course or this major. Change your major, it's junior year. There are consequences, though. Some faculty encourage that. And there's other reasons. Here is a very telling chart that I think if you showed a young person today and you're trying to impress upon them the value of education, take a look. The middle column, from bottom to top, references the level of education. You dropped out of high school all the way up to professional and advanced degrees. This side, the left side, shows the likely unemployment rate for students by level of education. Look at how this goes. Clearly, the more education you have, the less likely you're to be unemployed. There's exceptions. Of course there's exceptions. We know the PhD who's driving a taxi cab. We know the guy who dropped out of college and is a billionaire. Those are exceptions. This is the fact. Look at the right side. What is your typical income based on level of education? Look what happens here. It's clear. This is weekly earnings, including all total compensation. The high school dropout, the bachelor's degree. I mean, these numbers shout. And I think they would be pretty impressive if you're trying to convince individuals about going on and the need for college. Unfortunately today, a lot of people talk about the cost of college as another commodity, like you're buying a car. It's not a commodity. You look at it as an investment that's going to have a return for the rest of your life. What kind of return? You also want to put college in perspective. If you're borrowing money to go to school, and let's say the typical student borrows between $20,000 and $25,000 today to go to a 4-year school, what is the percentage of that debt against the 4-year cost? That's another perspective. If you went to a Notre Dame, the cost is $250,000 over 4 years. A $25,000 debt is 10%. Is that reasonable? What is a reasonable amount of debt is going to vary from student to student. What kind of job they're going to have, who they're going to marry, what kind of advanced education they're looking for. There are a lot of moving parts to determining what is a reasonable amount of debt. There is no simple answer. What happens to the individual who gets educated? We just saw the statistics on the previous chart. There are huge financial benefits. You're also going to have access to health care because you're working full-time. Your employer is going to provide a health care program. So you're going to be healthier. You're going to live longer because you have been educated. Your children will probably be healthier, and they'll want to go to college because of the environment at the home. You're less likely to be unemployed and in prison the more education you have. You're going to be more involved in your community. You're going to wear your seatbelt. You're probably not going to be likely to smoke. You're going to vote. These good things often follow education. And you're usually going to be more civil because you've been educated. You wonder about that these days, but typically you're going to be more civil. And you're going to be open to other points of view. Finally, you, the individual, are going to have a greater appreciation of life because you've been educated. These are all benefits to the individual. What happens to society if we have more education? We're going to have an increased tax base. More people are going to be working and paying taxes. Higher level of productivity. We're going to have a reduced need for public subsidies for unemployment, health, crime, and welfare. We're going to have communities that are more involved. And as Dr. Marquez said yesterday, we're going to have more human capital in society to be more competitive in the global economy. There's a couple of phrases I'm sure you've all seen. A financial aid package is simply a combination of different resources from different places. Kinds of resources, they can be gifts, which are scholarships or grants. They can be self-help programs, such as loans and work. Sources of aid, the institution, the government, state and federal. Most states in the states will have a state grant program, but you can't take it out of state. Finally, there could be other sources, like employers, private foundations like the Kinesis Foundation. So here's some concepts. I've already referenced the fact that, unfortunately, not every student's going to have their need met. There's unmet need. What do you do with that? How are outside scholarships going to be treated by the school's policies? These are critical things you could share with your students and family. The importance of deadlines. Schools aren't saving money for late applicants. So be sure that you have them meet the deadline. And deadlines vary from school to school. That's reality. Harvard might be January 15th. Notre Dame is February 15th. Some schools don't have deadlines. It's first come, first served till the money runs out. It's important to complete the forms correctly and also to follow up with any requests that the schools might have. There's alternatives for paying for college, community college for a year or two and transfer. Co-op programs are a way to help earn some money. It might lengthen your program, but at the end, the experience as an intern might be very helpful. You can go part-time instead of full-time. ROTC still exists, Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines. You have a commission when you graduate. You have a job. Public service, there are certain kinds of public service that if you borrowed money, working in public service for a certain period of time can help pay down any educational debt. And finally, if there's an honorably discharged veteran, there are benefits for the veteran and there are benefits for his or her dependents. And they're as generous as the Veterans Benefit Program for Education has been since World War II. That was a great program. This one is very close. It's very generous. There's also various options for paying. You don't have to pay the whole thing at the beginning of the year or half in the fall, half in the spring. You could ask the school to stretch it out over 9 or 10-month payments. That might help some families. The PLUS loan is an educational loan provided by the federal government for parents to help meet unmet need or to help reduce what has been measured to be their family responsibility. There are private student loans. Be very, very careful. They might be more attractive interest rate-wise by a few points, basis points, not interest points. That difference, when you compare it to the benefits that a federal student loan provides for cancellation, for deferment, for death, there's no comparison. The federal loan program is always going to be a better deal. The last thing you want to look at is a private, non-government loan. And there's other ways of doing things too. This is, I'm getting near the end. This has all changed a couple weeks ago. This is not up to date yet. But the interest rates going forward on student loans have been reduced from the maximum 6.8% for undergraduates to a much lower number. The bad news is that that lower number is driven by the 10-year Treasury bill and reviewed every year. And it's going to go up. So there's a cap on how much it can be. But right now, this chart would try to explain or show if you borrowed $20,000, let's say, here's what your monthly payment's going to be over 10 years, 120 months, and this is the amount of additional interest you're going to pay on top of 20 if you borrowed 20 and you do the standard repayment. This column, the monthly payments and the amount of interest will both be less as a result of the change in interest rates. And again, that's still being, the new chart hasn't come out yet. Here's another little simple gauge. What do you think your income's going to be? You want to become a mechanical engineer. What's the starting salary across the country for mechanical engineers? Maybe it's $45,000. The banks used to say you should be able to afford 8 to 10% of your income monthly on an educational debt. So if you make $45,000, you should be able to afford somewhere in that range. It might be a helpful tool for you to help students make decisions. This is the final chart. It's a big pie chart. And it shows clearly who the dominant player. This is undergraduate aid. Not last year, but the year before. The new figures will come out in a couple months for 12-13. But you can see from this part of the pie, federal grant, all the way around to here, that's over 50% of the resources are federal. If you add federal tax incentives, they're even greater. But $185 billion, there's the part that states do, that schools, work study is a very small part, and then there's miscellaneous private scholarships. Well, thank you again for your attention, and I hope I didn't disrupt your meal.